Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started.
In the southern great city, the Duchy of Kherson, Padovangrad, in the estates of the rich southern nobleman, Prince Smirnov, a very important event took place. Many nobles gathered there and greeted his grace. And the man himself appeared there together with the girl. This man was Duke Smirnov together with the Duchess. He smiled and said that it must have been very surprising and difficult to go all this way. However, he was very glad that they had come to him after all. The aristocrats immediately laughed. One of them said that the Duchess was becoming more beautiful every day. And the other, smiling happily, also said that it was not at all surprising that the young lady was so beautiful, since such a noble duke was next to her. But at that moment the lady suddenly looked to the side and saw some children coming down from the second floor. The children turned out to be Katrina Smirnova, who was 9 years old, and Bianca, who was 8. As soon as the girls came down, their father immediately yelled at them, asking how many times he had already warned them not to run up the stairs because they might fall. Even though he tried to do it as politely as possible, it still didn't look very good. He also explained to the girls that if they continued running like that, they would get seriously injured and it would be very painful. The children were looking at him attentively at that moment. He was quite a caring father. Then Katrin, smiling, turned to them and said that Laika had puppies. So she asked if they could go and see them because they really wanted to. The father patted them on the head and asked them to greet the guests, and after that they could go. The girls immediately made curtsies and, having greeted all the aristocrats, stated their names. As soon as the aristocrats saw this, they immediately began to smile. And also one of the girls noticed that Lady Bianca was very shy. Another replied that it was very good for young girls to be modest, so it might help her in the future. After this, she suddenly turned her attention to the children who were sitting at the other end of the hall and asked them to quickly come up and greet his lordship. As soon as the children came, the woman immediately said that she decided that it would be very nice if their children could play with the young girls. So, she took them along to this event, thinking that new acquaintances are always good. The boys immediately tried to attract the attention of the young ladies in order to make friends, but the girls found it a little strange to see this. Catherine took control of the situation quite quickly and, turning around, said that she would go ahead with her sister and also took her hand. The guy, whose name was Avon, was very surprised that the girl ignored him. After all, this had never happened before. Everyone, on the contrary, wanted to talk to him as long as possible. He immediately looked at the Duke and with a smile on his face asked if they could also go with his daughters, because they would like to see these puppies. Of course, the man allowed him to do this. Meanwhile, Katrin ran into the kitchen with her sister to get some food. Approaching the bowl of potatoes, she immediately took several. When her sister asked in surprise what she was doing, Katrin immediately replied that she should feed him with these. But Katrin explained to Bianca that the puppies eat potatoes because they are still too small to chew anything at all. The girl also said that it would be better to give it to Laika instead of puppies because she would really like it. Her sister smiled and immediately put the potatoes in the bag, saying that she would do so. At this very moment, the boys had already gone out into the yard. They had gone there as soon as they were given permission. However, they had not come at all to examine the puppies. All three had slingshots in their hands, and they shot stones straight at the poor dog who was standing in front of her newborn puppies to protect them. And the boys at that moment only continued to mock and laugh. They shot stones at her, completely ignoring the fact that this was a helpless dog. Poor Laika could only whine and bark at them. At that moment, the Smirnov sisters had already arrived. As soon as the girls saw this, Katrin became so angry that she could not keep her emotions to herself. She headed straight towards these boys. Meanwhile, Bianca started crying very hard because she felt incredibly sorry for the poor dog, and she even dropped the potato on the floor. As soon as Katrin approached these boys, she didn't even look at the fact that she was a lady. She, without thinking, immediately hit one of them in the face. After that, she started on the other two. By that time, they were already lying on the ground and could not do anything more. Of course, the children were very scared and did not understand how she alone was able to put them all to bed, but they decided not to resist any longer so that things would not get worse. By that time, worried parents had already run out into the yard. They immediately began to sort out the situation and decided that children sometimes accidentally push each other during games, so they thought that there was nothing wrong with it. At this point, the boys were sitting on the grass and crying because they were in pain and they wanted to be pitied. One of them was approached by his mother, who immediately told him to get up on his feet and asked him what kind of real man would cry after a girl hit him. Meanwhile, Katrine defended herself. She replied that it was not an accident at all. Those horrible children were throwing stones at Laika with a slingshot, thereby mocking the poor, helpless animal. As soon as the aristocrats heard this, they were very shocked. They immediately began to whisper and looked in surprise at the boys who stood with their heads down. They immediately began to sympathize with the poor dog and also decided that these children had absolutely no manners. Avon, meanwhile, made a very sad expression on his face, and in a voice trembling with tears, he said that they were jealous because this lady paid attention only to the dog and not to them at all. So he said that they just wanted to play together with her too, and she didn't pay them any attention at all. As soon as the adults heard this, they immediately began to feel sorry for them and realized that the boys were doing this only to attract attention to themselves. As soon as Catherine saw this, she was shocked. She looked at the expression on her opponent's face and could not believe that he actually said this. But at that moment, the boy got down on one knee in front of her and, bowing his head, said that he was really very sorry. After this, he kissed her hand and asked her to forgive this rudeness with her generous heart and not to harbor a grudge against him. But as soon as he did it in front of everyone, he immediately looked into her eyes and, smiling slyly, whispered that she had become overly sensitive because of a little prank. Of course, the girl felt unpleasant about this remark. She pulled her hand away and was very unhappy that he was present at this event at all. As soon as people saw this gesture, they were amazed that she could allow herself to do such a thing, because it was completely contrary to the ladylike manners that she had to strictly observe. Avon himself laughed at this point and said that he did not understand why she needed to provoke him like that. Soon, when evening came, everyone gathered in one room to have dinner, and by that time, the children had already been put to bed because they had eaten a little earlier. Catherine and her sister were lying in the same room. Bianca had already fallen asleep, and the older girl was still full of various thoughts. Soon she was completely unable to lie in one place. So she got out of bed and went to the room where the three boys were placed. As soon as the door opened and sunlight entered the room, Avon managed to open his eyes, but he closed them back rather quickly because he was very tired that day. Meanwhile, Catherine was able to do what she wanted. So when they woke up the next time, they found themselves tied up and couldn't figure out how this had happened. After the older boy looked to the side, he saw Catherine there. She turned to them and with a smile on her face asked if he had finally woken up. She also teased him by saying that she had completely forgotten his name, but was still very happy to see him in such a good mood. Catherine had a bow and arrow in her hands, and she asked if he had been right in saying that he would like to play with her a little earlier. Of course, the guy didn't like all this, because he understood where it was all leading, and the girl in the meantime came up and put an apple on his head so that she could aim an arrow at him next time. He tried to resist, but he was unable to do so. Whatever he tried to say was completely inaudible because of the bandage. So Catherine turned to him and told him to be quiet. She also added that from now on they would play a very interesting and fun game, and she hoped he would like it. After that, the girl walked away a little and began to take out her first arrow. She said that if she hit all the apples on his head with this bow, she would win. Without thinking, she immediately drew an arrow on her bow and said that if she missed, they would continue until she hit everything. After she said this phrase, she immediately released an arrow, but the arrow unfortunately did not hit the apple. It stuck into the wall a little above his head. Catherine pretended to be upset. Then she took the second arrow and said that her aim was a little off, so she decided to try again. At that moment, tears began to well up in all the boys' eyes because they really became afraid for their lives. Meanwhile, Catherine said that if they didn't want the arrow to accidentally hit the wrong side, then they better not move, because then she wouldn't be able to control the situation. As soon as the girl fired the next time, the arrow missed again and hit the papers that were lying very close to the boy. This loud sound immediately made him shudder and scream. At this time, the parents heard strange sounds and immediately went upstairs to see what was going on. As soon as they opened the door, they immediately saw their sons with bandaged hands, feet, mouths, and apples on their heads. Meanwhile, Catherine simply stood behind them and hid the bow behind her back, pretending that nothing was happening. The parents, meanwhile, had already untied their sons and began to console them, not understanding what had happened and why all this was done. Then one of the aristocrats hugged his son and asked how the girl could do such a thing, and also asked if this was really her revenge for what happened during the day. Catherine put on an innocent expression and, looking at her arrow, wondered how they could even think that this was revenge. She also said that it was just a game, so she doesn't understand why her parents were so upset. They were all having fun. After that, she put the arrow aside and, raising her head up, said that she just wanted to play and get to know each other better. But they continued to sleep all this time, so she decided to wake them up and spend time together. The mother of one of the boys immediately started yelling at her and said that she didn't know before, but now she understands that Catherine is doing all this on purpose. The girl immediately smiled and asked mockingly if they really didn't know this before. Just as she was about to say something in her defense, Catherine stepped forward and said that this was exactly why she said it. The parents immediately looked at each other in surprise, not understanding what she was even talking about, so they asked again what she meant. The girl, folding her arms across her chest, said that they would only understand this when they could experience it for themselves, so there was no point in scaring others for fun. She addressed the boys directly and said that a person can only understand how painful it is when the same thing is done to him. Therefore, they should no longer hit other children or animals without thinking about the consequences. Of course, one of the fathers was not at all satisfied with this conversation, and he began to shout at her. But at that moment, the Duke also managed to approach the place of the commotion and asked what was going on there. One of the angry parents immediately ran to Catherine's father and said that she had shot a sharp arrow at their children. He pointed his finger at her and said that she scared them all and called it just a joke, but he was sure that she did it on purpose. As soon as the father heard this, he sighed heavily and put his hand on his forehead, fully aware of what the consequences might be. But at that moment the door opened again and Bianca came into the room with tears in her eyes. She said that her sister had done absolutely nothing wrong. At that moment, the dog they visited during the day entered the room with her. The girl lifted the fur on the dog's body, and a small wound immediately became visible. Bianca answered in a trembling voice that it was these young people who first did something like this to the husky. She also said that even though the adults saw and heard the details of the situation, they still acted as if it had not happened, which is very unfair to their children. The father approached his youngest daughter, wiped away her tears, and asked if it was all true. Bianca replied that it was all true. Besides, those boys were pulling her hair and calling her names, and her sister just wanted to protect her and the husky. As soon as Catherine heard these words, tears began to well up in her eyes too. She couldn't believe that her sister stood up for her like that. But at that moment, the Duke suddenly stood up and said that, in his opinion, they had better cancel the investment proposal they had been talking about. Upon hearing this, the male aristocrats immediately became indignant and turned to the Duke, saying that it was very stupid to carry over children's misunderstandings into official matters. But he glanced at them with great irritation in his voice and asked if their proposal was not directly related to animal husbandry. After this, he took his daughters by the hands and said that by looking at the behavior of their sons, he could guess how they treated the cattle on their farms without even visiting them. As he left, he closed the door behind him and asked that they leave his estate as soon as dawn came. Before she finally left, Catherine glanced back at the boy, who was sitting with his head down. He knew exactly what he had done and knew that he would have to serve his punishment. But as soon as she saw tears in his eyes, she immediately smiled. She was pleased to realize that he, too, had experienced the pain he had caused the helpless animal. Walking along the corridors, the girl thought that always being kind is not good for a person. Sometimes, in her opinion, you need to show anger too. So from that moment on, she was going to continue causing trouble and living the way she wanted, without limiting herself. Catherine knew she only lived once, and she believed it would be easier to live with memories and dignity than to be ruled by everyone. After all this, in the southern region, whenever the newspapers mentioned the villain, everyone immediately thought of Catherine. If a child came along and pulled a little girl's hair, she would grab him by the hair and just throw him away as revenge. Also, if there was a kid on the streets who was lifting up a girl's skirt without her consent, Catherine would step on his pants and they would just slide down in full view of everyone. There was a trend among men in the southern region to wear a belt on their trousers, and rumors began to circulate that it was because Catherine was taking their trousers off too often. The years passed, the girl grew up, and she stopped wearing skirts, switching completely to a military uniform. One day, when Catherine returned from another of her charitable missions, a maid ran into her and asked if she had really just returned, since she had been gone all night. When the girl did not answer, the maid ran closer to her, and in the meantime Catherine began to take off her coat. The maid took the coat and asked if Catherine had forgotten that she had an appointment for that day, since she had been expected for a very long time. As soon as Catherine heard about this, she was a little surprised and said that she just needed to go to the reception area, so she didn't see any problem with it. But the maid stopped and asked if she could come right away in that case, and also said that she should change her clothes. Catherine was a little surprised to hear this, but replied that the appointment had not yet been made and that the man had arrived early. Turning to the maid, she added that it was impolite to keep people waiting. She decided not to change her clothes, so she soon went downstairs and entered the room where an older man was already waiting for her. He tugged at his red mustache when suddenly the door opened, and looking to the side he saw a girl. He immediately rose to his feet and, smiling, said that he was very glad to finally meet Lady Catherine, adding that it was a great honor for him. Bowing slightly, the man introduced himself as Georgie, while the girl closed the door behind her and said that she was also pleased to meet him. He laughed awkwardly and noted that she had taken too long on her way to the meeting, which meant he had to wait for her alone for quite a long time. At this point, Catherine took out her watch, looked at the time, and said with a smile on her face that she was not that late, so she did not see any problem with it. Of course, George didn't like this, so he asked her why she came dressed like that. The girl, meanwhile, walked by, and sitting down on the sofa, replied that she had come to this place because she had learned that he was waiting, although she had just returned from hunting, so she had not had time to change her clothes, but decided to go to him straight away. After that, she pointed to the place opposite her and suggested that they sit down first and only then start the conversation. George didn't like all this, but he sat down opposite her and said that she looked happy, so he ventured to suggest that she really enjoyed hunting. Catherine, examining her gun, replied that wild boars had been appearing frequently lately, so she had to go out hunting deer often. Because of them, the common people were suffering damage to their crops. After listening to her, the man took his tea and said that this, of course, was not quite an appropriate hobby for a lady of her status. Catherine, hearing this, was very indignant and immediately asked him whether he really thought there was such a thing as a suitable hobby for a lady. George immediately replied that young ladies like her usually had a hobby, but it was not hunting, but a craft or gardening, something refined and worthy of her status. Catherine immediately explained that she was only doing this because the commoners couldn't summon a hunter every time. She genuinely wanted to help them, so she was doing this. The man tried to be polite and said that he understood this perfectly well. However, since the Duke's family had no son, she simply had no choice now. But he also believed that she would certainly stop doing this when she became a countess. Catherine suddenly laughed and asked if it was too early to talk about her becoming a countess, since he hadn't even proposed to her directly yet. George was so angry at this point that he even put his cup of tea on the table, spilled a little of it, and asked if she really thought she had a better candidate than him. The man suddenly raised his voice and said that 3 social seasons had already passed, and most young ladies married as soon as they turned 18. But Catherine was already 21 by then and had never been married before. The girl was then genuinely surprised, and looking him straight in the eyes, said that she had heard that the Count was even older than her father. George then replied that it was not that he could not marry, but that he had decided not to do so, since there had never been a worthy young lady who could seize him. He also said that, of course, Lady Bianca's appearance and character attracted his interest more, but there was too much competition, so he decided to take the easier path. Catherine sighed heavily at this point, then placed her feet, which had a lot of dirt on them, on the table, wondering if this was really the case. The man, meanwhile, immediately noticed her manners and suddenly began to shout, calling her Lady Katie. However, the girl quickly interrupted him and said that he was pronouncing her name incorrectly. The correct pronunciation was Catherine. The girl also responded that she felt very uncomfortable hearing him use informal language and abbreviations when they were not close enough to do so. The man, having calmed down a little, immediately asked her for forgiveness and said that he had been too familiar, so he would not do it again. She immediately shook her head and asked him to continue what he was saying in that case. The man cleared his throat and said that he thought it would be quite interesting for him to live with her. Catherine immediately asked, surprised, if he thought it was funny. To somehow save the situation, George replied that since she had said that hunting was her hobby, she should know that there was a certain pleasure in killing a ferocious wild animal. But Catherine, showing no interest in the conversation at all, said that she had nothing to do with it. After that, she took her weapon in her hands again and, pointing it at the man, said that when she hunts, she prefers to finish everything on the spot. She also said that, of course, taming a wild animal is an exciting process, but for her it is not important to tame it, but to hold its life in her hands and play with it. As soon as the man heard about this, he was very surprised. But at that moment, she had already started aiming at his head and asked if he was really that ignorant or just stupid. When he asked what was going on, Catherine replied that it meant she had no intention of giving him a chance to hold her life in his hands. George was very surprised at this point and asked why she even thought he was going to hold her life in his hands. But at that moment, Catherine shot back and said that if she didn't like something, then she didn't see the point in even trying to fix it. If she didn't want to hear nonsense, then she could just get rid of the one who was saying it. Continuing to aim at him, she said that she accidentally missed. She always knows where to hit. George was so scared that he jumped back and said that that was why she couldn't get married. He thought she was just crazy. At that very time, a man met a merchant in the city. As soon as this merchant saw His Highness, he immediately bowed and said that he could take care of the horse, so there was no need for him to worry about it at all. He immediately smiled. This person turned out to be Ivan, and he asked where they would like to go first. At that moment, the guy with gray hair took off his hood once he was sure no one was looking and said that he would like to start by gathering information. At that moment, the father, sitting in his estate, learned not very happy news, so, as always, he was very upset and even angry. Bianca sat next to him, and the man, sighing heavily, said that everything was starting all over again, and he thought that this man was a refined gentleman. The girl, sipping tea, replied that he really hoped that the man was not going to kill her or hurt her because of it. But the man didn't have time to answer her when suddenly George started running past their room. He turned to His Highness and said that even if he offered half of his wealth, there would not be a single fool who would marry this wild woman. Meanwhile, Catherine ran after him with a gun and, shouting at him, asked how he even dared to think that he could surpass her. The girl also said that she would rather live her entire life alone than marry someone like this man. After that, George ran towards the exit because he was not going to stay there for another minute, and Catherine went into the room to her family. Meanwhile, the father turned to the butler and said that if something was broken upstairs, they needed to clean it up thoroughly because his children could step on it and get hurt. At this point, Bianca turned to her sister and, handing her the cookies, asked how many times she had already refused everyone. The girl frowned and replied that this was not the first time, so she was already starting to get tired of it. At that moment, her father suddenly became very sad and said that it was not so easy to find a groom for her in the southern continent now. He had promised her mother that he would be able to raise her so well. Tears began to appear in his eyes, and he said that he could not look her in the face any longer if this continued. Of course, Catherine felt a little offended for her father, and after that, she wondered if she really needed to get married so badly. Her father immediately asked her what she meant, and Catherine said that she wanted to know whether she was really obliged to marry someone she didn't like. The man smiled awkwardly and said that he would check if there were any suitors in the north, so she shouldn't worry too much about it. In this way, he simply moved away from a topic that was not very convenient and awkward for him. But at that moment, Catherine stood up and, slamming her hand on the table, said that if she had to go down to the underworld, she would rather not marry at all. Of course, her father was already very tired of her antics and words because society simply demanded that she get married and be like everyone else. Bianca immediately supported her sister with applause, And at that moment the butler, entering the room, addressed His Highness and said that they had received proposals of marriage for the younger lady. He waved his hand and asked them to send negative answers to all of them, because until his eldest daughter Catherine got married, Bianca was not allowed to do so either. As soon as Catherine heard this, she became very indignant and asked why Bianca had to be dragged into all this. But the man at that moment turned to his youngest daughter and asked if she had any objections. She, hugging her sister by the hand, replied that of course not. She was perfectly fine and ready to live the rest of her life just like her. That same evening, George went to a local bar to relax a little after such a busy day. One of the young guys there ordered a glass of beer, and while talking to George, asked if it made any sense at all. Of course, he was very upset because he was refused the proposal to marry Bianca, so he was very outraged by what was written in the letter. And it was written that until Catherine got married, Bianca was also forbidden to do so. So he didn't understand what had happened at the Duke's residence last week for the Duke to decide such a thing. Other young people, who were also very upset about this, supported him and said that they had also received rejections. George, at this point slamming his hand on the table, said that this issue had already been decided, so he didn't understand why they needed to look for a reason. They had to think about what to do with Catherine. This young man turned out to be his son, and looking up, he asked who would want to marry such a wild woman as she. And George replied that in order to catch a wild woman, you need to have another one with you. His son was very surprised and asked what he meant by that. The man asked, "Won't Count Petrovsky from the north be involved in this story?" And the boy asked, "Does he mean Avon's second son?" The young man thought for a moment and said that he hadn't gotten along with Catherine, and that had been the case since childhood. The chances of success were unlikely, so he didn't understand why they were even trying so hard for it. George, with a smile on his face, told him not to worry. After all, they had already accepted it on their part, so there was almost nothing left for them to do. At that moment, Avon walked into the bar and, turning to the red-haired man, said that he had already arrived. He immediately smiled and, waving his hand, told him to sit down. Ivan approached the group of men and, patting George on the shoulder, he thanked him for what he did last time because the man simply saved his life. The man didn't answer, and Avon, sitting down opposite them, asked, "Are they really all his source of money?" As soon as the guy with blonde hair heard this, he immediately stood up and asked what he meant when he said that. The guy smiled and replied that when they ask someone to do a job, only common sense tells them that they should first give an advance and then do something. George, angry, turned to him and asked what this was supposed to mean because he really didn't understand. Avon replied that the last time they spoke, he had said that as a condition, he would take care of all the trading gambling debts. But then, thinking about it, he felt that he had named too low a price for a nearly impossible job. The men were desperate, so they asked him to name the amount he wanted, and then they would think about the offer. George raised his hand and, showing his palm, asked if something big, approximately for this amount, would suit him. But Avon, laughing, asked if they were not all suitors for Bianca. And he also said that Catherine should be the first to marry, so that the others could marry her sister. The guys immediately started talking among themselves, confirming that this was indeed true, and thought about what to offer this impudent man. The last long time, Ivan suddenly stood up and said that if they could not afford it, then in that case, he would leave immediately. As soon as they heard this, they immediately said that he should not do this, because everyone agreed to it. And holding out his palm, he asked that people collect money in this bag. After some time, he had filled up completely, and Avon, seeing this amount, said that it was very good. After that, I asked if he remembered correctly that the letter with the proposal could be submitted the next day. George answered that this was indeed the case, and the other men were very surprised, and it was hard to believe that he would marry that witch, so they thought that he was really a man who deserved respect. Avon at this point looked at his bag of money and said that it was all mutual cooperation in such things, so he didn't look at pride. Of course, at that moment, he was only thinking about the fact that he still had to pay off the debts to this woman that remained from his childhood, so for him it was a good offer. After some time, the men poured Avon a drink and made various toasts, praising him. They believed that the only man who could break Catherine's spirit was Lord Petrovsky. At that moment, two guys were sitting at the next table. One of them turned out to be a guy with gray hair. His assistant immediately turned to the owner and asked where he was looking so intently. The man immediately turned to him and said that it was completely unimportant, and also asked what had happened with their investigation. The assistant, covering his mouth with his hand so that no one could hear them, said that this place was very noisy, so he suggested leaving and discussing all this later. He wanted to tell him about it on the way, so without thinking twice, they got up and started to leave the bar, which was indeed very noisy. But at that moment, one of the drunk men who were sitting at the next table suddenly noticed these guys in black capes. He immediately looked at his friend, who was also quite drunk, and asked if he was leading those suspicious men who had just passed by. But the guy could barely make out his words at all, so he didn't even answer anything before that. And his friend, thinking, said that it even seemed to him that one of the men had silver hair. His friend immediately laughed and did not take the words seriously at all. After calming down a bit, he said that if he had silver hair, it meant he was from the Northern Duke's family. But in that case, he highly doubted that such an important person would be in a bar like this. Catherine was not far from this very bar at that moment. She decided to go into the gun store. Of course, she was incredibly glad that she had managed to slip out of the house and that her father had not noticed her. After all, if she hadn't succeeded, and her father had found out that she had run away, she would have missed out on this wonderful store with incredible murder weapons again. She took the sword for herself, which is exactly what she came for in the first place. It was displayed in the very center of the display case, so the girl was even a little afraid at first that it would be taken away before she could. At that moment, the doors to the store suddenly opened, and the very same two men who had left the bar earlier walked in. Catherine immediately began to head for the exit, completely ignoring these men, because she was very happy with her purchase and completely ignored everything that was happening around her. While the girl was walking, she even started humming some melody, and as soon as she reached the doors, the man with silver hair just approached the counter behind which the seller stood. He addressed him directly and asked the man if he had also come to find the scars of the shear, and also said that he had just left, so he should have come a little earlier. As soon as Catherine heard these words, she was a little surprised, because she did not understand why the seller said that they had just taken this thing, because they could have simply said that it was not there and left it at that. So, in order for her not to have any more problems and troubles, she very quickly went to the exit, thinking that she needed to hurry. And the man with silver hair at that moment, sighing heavily, threw a hood over his head and, turning to Boris, told him to go immediately. The guy was a little worried. He looked at his boss and asked, "Is this even fair, since he waited all this time to take this thing?" But the man ignored these words. He suddenly paid attention to the floor because there was something shiny lying there and immediately picked it up. After this, he approached the seller and asked if he was the owner of this watch. But the man, looking closely at this golden thing, said that this was absolutely not so, and also added that most likely it was the young lady who had just bought the last shamshir who had released them by accident. As soon as the silver-haired guy heard that the customer was a woman, he was really surprised. The salesman at this point continued to look at the watch and said that he couldn't say for sure, because the girl was wearing trousers, and she wanted the item so badly that she even offered a reservation fee of 10 times the usual amount. He also said that the only thing he could think of was a vague description of her appearance. He explained to the men that she had strawberry blonde hair. The guy didn't say that he understood everything, and also added that in that case he would return them when he met this person. And at that moment, he came up with a plan in his head. He was going to exchange the expensive shamshir that he needed for this very watch using his negotiating skills. Meanwhile, Catherine was walking at a fairly fast pace through the night city. She breathed a sigh of relief when she walked as far away from the store as possible, thinking that she had almost lost her shamshir. But at that moment, someone crept up behind her. This person grabbed her hand and, whispering in her ear in a quiet voice, he said that they had not seen each other for a long time with Catherine. The girl didn't lose her head. She immediately hit the man straight in the stomach and, screaming loudly throughout the street, asked who he was. Avon at this point moved back a little because the pain in his stomach had intensified, but with an evil smile on his face he asked, "Did she really not remember him?" When he saw her surprised expression, he immediately explained that he still clearly remembers how she threatened him with a bow when he was a child. Then the girl took a closer look and immediately recognized the man who stood in front of her, but she didn't like it at all. Avon turned to Catherine with a malicious smile on his face and said that he almost didn't even recognize her, because she had really grown up and thus turned into an adult woman. Of course, Catherine was not at all happy to meet him, so she made an angry face, snorted, and said that he was still as disgusting as always, attacking people in the middle of the street at night. As soon as the guy heard this, he immediately started laughing loudly and said that he still had the last word, so he didn't understand why she was acting so self-confident. Meanwhile, Catherine leaned down and began to take out one thing from the bag she was holding in her hands. Meanwhile, Avon asked her if she thought it would hurt if she got hit the same way he did. But she, looking him straight in the eyes, said that this was absolutely not true. After that, she took out her instrument and, hitting the guy on the head, said that she had long dreamed of doing this properly. At that moment, Avon landed on the ground on his butt and now had a musical instrument on his head. And Catherine, with the same angry expression on her face, said that when she turns into a woman, it is an insult, so she was not going to just leave it like that. Of course, the man was very offended by this, and with a voice trembling with anger, he asked what the hell that was. By that time, some of the guys had already left the bar and were heading their way. They were all drunk, but they could still see a female silhouette picking up her things from the floor. One of the guys turned to them in surprise and asked what was going on, but as soon as they saw Catherine, someone in the crowd immediately shouted to arrest this woman. Without thinking twice, one of the guys, who was the least drunk, ran after the girl and tried to grab her hand, asking, "Who is she anyway?" However, Catherine managed to dodge in time and then delivered her blow. Thus, she was able to neutralize 3 drunkards with one kick. After that, she dropped everything and started running away. The girl didn't even notice that the rope had fallen off the weapon she had just bought. The men immediately became indignant. They began shouting and talking about getting her drunk, so Avon ordered them all to run after her. But Catherine could run pretty fast, so she got a few meters ahead of these drunk people. At this very time, Boris and his master were sitting on one of the roofs and carefully watching the situation. The guy already wanted to turn to his boss and say something, but as soon as he turned his head to the side, he saw that he was no longer there. After that, he looked at the other roof and saw the silhouette of a man. This man turned to Boris and told him to wait in that place for a while, and also said that he would return soon. At that moment, the drunk men stopped. They stopped running because they were a little tired and began to look around, asking where the girl had gone. Talking to each other, they understood that they had to find her as soon as possible. After all, if they lost sight of her, it would be really bad. Catherine, meanwhile, managed to escape behind the alley and hid around the corner. Breathing heavily, she heard the voices of those drunken men nearby, but she knew they were on the wrong track. This thought calmed her down very much and even pleased the girl, so that very soon she calmed her breathing and dared to look out from around the corner. Then she grabbed the weapon she had bought in her hands and was about to swing it at the man who was around the corner, but she didn't have time because the guy with silver hair stopped her by grabbing the handle. Catherine was a little surprised, but she felt his hand on hers and knew that his grip was quite strong. But despite all this girl continued to hold the gun near his neck. She, choking with anger, told him not to move. After all, if he did not want to get hurt, he should just stand still. She also, looking him straight in the eyes, asked, "Does he really work with Petrovsky?" The man, hearing about this, was very surprised because he had never even heard of such a person's last name and therefore asked her who he was. Catherine suddenly started yelling at him and told him not to play with her and not to pretend, because he wouldn't have followed her if he didn't know who this Petrovsky was. But at that moment, the man began to take out with one hand, slowly, from his pocket, the watch that she had lost, and said that he simply wanted to give her something. But Catherine, seeing that he was reaching into his pocket, pulled the sword even closer, and screaming, said that he must not move. She also added that perhaps he did not know her. However, it was a real sword, so he should not make unnecessary movements. The guy was even a little scared, but after that, He said that he knew perfectly well that it was a real sword, and asked if by any chance it was the shamshir that she had bought earlier in the store. Catherine became even more wary. She asked who he was, and also, was he really following her? But at that moment, the guy took a watch out of his pocket and handed it to the girl. She even lost her speech for a while, and the guy with silver hair explained that he went to the store to get this shamshir. However, when he first arrived, he saw that the girl was already leaving. He also said that he thought that it was she who dropped the watch, so he decided to go after her to return it. At that moment, Catherine took the weapon away from him, and taking her watch, asked why he had chased her with such a scary look if he had simply wanted to give her things. The girl also said that for a moment she thought he was going to kill her, but the man adjusted his hood and replied that this was what his normal face looked like, so she shouldn't worry. But Catherine, smiling happily, put her watch in her pocket and said that, however it might be, she was really grateful to him for returning the thing. But then suddenly, as soon as she was about to leave, he put his hand on her shoulder and told her to wait. The girl, looking at him in surprise, immediately asked what he wanted. And the man asked if she was ready to sell him this shamshir, because he could give her a price 5 times higher than the one she bought it for. Catherine was even a little scared when she heard this, but then she said that she forgot the body for 10 times the original price, and now he wants her to sell it for only 5. The man, lowering his head, asked her what she thought in that case about it being 15 times more. Catherine suddenly started yelling at him very loudly and said that she was actually busy enough to continue these conversations. She also said that he was incredibly annoying to her and suggested that he leave as soon as possible before she got completely angry and started hitting him. The man just looked at her completely calmly and then asked, "Did she really just tell him that?" But the girl, with irritation in her voice, asked who else was present nearby. He said that it was true. However, he still didn't like the way she talked to him. The girl had already stopped listening to him by that time and moved on. Catherine, looking out from behind the alley, said that she was being followed, so she did not have time to sort out this terrible relationship. But the man immediately replied that she did not need to worry about it because he had already made it so that they would get lost. The girl, hearing this, looked at him in surprise and asked what he meant. The guy immediately explained that regardless of whether they were drunk or not, they tripped over their own feet when they ran after him, so getting rid of them was not at all difficult for him. Catherine immediately asked if he had really gotten rid of them all. He then merely bowed in agreement. She smiled and said that anyone should drink responsibly before drinking, and that it was completely inappropriate to behave like that when drunk. But the guy completely ignored her words and asked how about if the price for the item was 20 times more. This, of course, angered her, and she said that he was quite persistent and asked if he even knew how much it cost. The girl also said that she scraped together all the money she had in order to buy it, including selling some jewelry. Then the guy replied that he also had to scrape together a significant amount of money to even consider buying it. So he remains on the same level as her. Catherine immediately asked how much money he was talking about, and he replied that he had invested his entire fortune in it. The girl, frowning, said that he had apparently taken up a rather dangerous hobby that could ruin the finances of his entire family. Therefore, she advised him not to engage in such reckless actions in the future. After that, she grabbed her sword more tightly and said that he could pay her the original price and stop this kind of collecting. He took what she gave him and immediately asked what it was supposed to mean, and Catherine asked, "Is it true that he's not married yet?" After that, she said that when he had a family, all expenses would increase, so he needed to start saving in advance. The man replied that he could pay several times more, but Catherine replied that she did not need that, and suggested that they settle for the usual amount, since she had already made her final decision. She handed him the item and took the bag of money from her, also saying that technical additions to such markings were illegal in any case, so she did not want to end up in prison because of some weapon. But the man replied in an indignant voice that he didn't mean that, but that he could pay. But Catherine continued to say her own, and said that there were a lot of pickpockets in the area, so he shouldn't carry so much cash with him. After that, she turned around and started to walk away, telling him to live a good life from now on, and just left. At that moment, Boris had already run up to the man. He stopped next to him, tried to catch his breath, and turning to His Highness asked, Is he really doing this seriously? The guy looked at him and immediately asked what he meant, and also said that he wasn't even hurt. But his assistant suddenly started shouting and said that those men were injured. That's why he was so outraged. The silver-haired man thought for a moment and replied that at least he didn't use a weapon this time, so they weren't hurt too much. And Boris replied that all those people who fought him with their bare hands eventually saw the gates of the other world, so he caused serious damage to them. Even the man didn't like the way he was saying all this, so after closing the topic, he said that in the end they didn't die, so he thought it was okay. Boris realized that they had better move on from this topic and asked if he had delivered the goods that they had found at Catherine's. As soon as the guy heard her name, he was immediately surprised, and Boris explained that the man on his way called this name. He also said that he had a leash on his neck, and he screamed very loudly, looking after where the girl ran. So he is absolutely sure that this is her name. At that moment, Boris felt goosebumps all over his body, and he said that he had never seen such a woman in his life, and she was like a fighting cock, knocking down everyone in her path and ready to defend her position to the end. His boss immediately smiled and said that he too had never met a woman who would put a sword to his neck. As soon as Boris heard about this, he immediately became frightened and asked, "Did she really put a sword to his neck?" Therefore, at that moment, he was overcome with fear that she was still alive, because his master could do absolutely anything to her after such a disrespectful gesture. They went on together, and Boris, after a short silence, asked, "Are all women in the South so hot-tempered?" And his boss answered that he doubted it very much, because it seemed extremely unlikely to him. She was simply special. When the guy heard this, he sighed heavily and said that he was very sorry, because she was quite charming. As soon as the silver-haired man heard this, he immediately froze in place. But Boris didn't see it right away, so he accidentally ran straight into his back with his nose. The boss turned to him and said that it was as if fate had provided this girl Catherine for him. Boris, touching his wounded nose, asked what he planned to do with this information in that case. The guy smiled and asked, "Who knows? However, he will definitely come up with something so that it will be profitable for him." The next morning, as promised, Catherine met her father and, pointing to the newspaper, asked if it was Avon, since the name of the eldest son was written there. The man, having carefully studied the document, which she then handed to him, said that the handwriting matched the handwriting of Bishop Pavel. He had exchanged letters with him earlier. After that, he immediately asked her where she got this letter from. At that moment, Catherine smiled and thought that she certainly couldn't say that they just met by chance during their escape last night. So she said that she had heard from people and their rumors that Avon had returned to the South. Her father, smiling, said that if it really was him, then of course, he was also against this proposal, because Vladimir Pavel was a difficult person who was not quite suitable for this family. Catherine immediately asked how he knew all this. In fact, they had been discussing the letter that had arrived from Avon asking for an engagement. Her father, answering the question, asked if she remembered the winner of the last night's tournament. In fact, the night's tournament was a special competition that was held once every 4 years in the capital of the Duchy of Herzen. Knights and soldiers from completely different countries and states took part in this prestigious event. For many generations, it was held under the name of the family of Duke Vasily Herzen and was known for its strict impartiality, without allowing favorites. And as soon as Catherine heard about it, her eyes immediately lit up. She replied that, of course, she remembered, because for a commoner, victory was something unusual. She also said that he was so impressive during the competition that she even regretted that she could not watch the final live, because she was sure that it was a spectacular spectacle. Her father immediately smiled and said that Lord Pavel was in fact the winner of this tournament. He entered the competition under a false name and, after winning, became a high-ranking officer. Thoughtfully, the father said that he had come to the South for work, but he rarely had time, and he would like to invite Catherine to his villa in order to get to know her. As soon as the girl heard this, she was very surprised. Then she looked at the letter that her father had given her after that. She also said that, however, he is Avon's older brother, so she thinks it will be a little awkward, since they probably look a lot alike, since they are brothers. But the man replied that in fact they were complete opposites of each other, because in some moments he could not even recognize them as brothers. He also said that this time he would make sure that he matched Catherine's taste. Her ideal type is a handsome and skilled man, so he believes that he can find one for her. The girl, meanwhile, put the letter back on the table and asked why the person had to be excluded. Her father smiled and said that it was true. She agreed with her ideal type. His personality should be straightforward and silent. Catherine was silent at this point. However, she did not understand why her father was doing all this, and the man continued to speak. He took the letter in his hands and said that after this he would send a reply, saying that she would accept his invitation and come to visit. As soon as she heard this, she indignantly said that she had not yet answered him definitively, and of course, did not agree. But her dad wasn't interested in that at all. He had already sealed the envelope and said that it was already written on her face that she really wanted to meet him, so that's why he made that decision. Catherine was, of course, very angry, but she tried to keep her emotions to herself. She thought about his virtues. He was kind, experienced in martial arts, and probably quite strong, since he could win the tournament. She also decided that if he was as handsome as the man she had met on the street the night before, she thought he might actually be worth meeting then. And so, several days passed from that moment, and finally the moment came when Catherine had to go visit. A small carriage with escorts drove up to the estate. Then a man entered, and behind him were several guards. The man bowed and turned to his grace and said that by order of the young master, they had come to escort Lady Catherine to the estate. Of course, her father was a little surprised and said that he did not expect them to come because he thought that she herself would be able to go there, but he thanked them for it. The man, smiling, immediately said that it was quite natural to come personally to accompany the lady, so they decided to ensure the safe transportation of Lady Catherine to the estate in this way. Meanwhile, the girl was already completely ready. She was wearing a stunning, lush purple dress with various decorations that matched her incredibly beautifully. As soon as she was ready, she went downstairs and, already entering the carriage, said that everything would be fine, so that her father and Bianca should not worry about her journey. The girl said goodbye to her relatives, who came to see her off. Her father said that he hoped that she would have a good conversation with Count Pavel, and her younger sister was very upset, but asked that her sister return home as soon as possible and be sure to tell her everything in detail. Catherine immediately replied to her father that she would do everything in her power, and also replied to her sister that she would return as soon as she could. After this, the door to the carriage closed and it set off, followed by 2 knights on horseback, who accompanied the girl directly. As Catherine rode alone, she thought about how she was heading to the winner of the knights' tournament. She certainly didn't like the fact that he was Avon's brother, but she wondered what kind of sword he used. And she also wondered, was he really as good a shooter as she was? Quite a few more thoughts visited her beautiful head while they were driving, but towards the end of the road, she simply decided to look at the beautiful views that were visible from there. Catherine, looking straight out the window, wondered how long they would continue to drive through the forest, because it looked as if they were going deeper and deeper, and this began to alarm her. Well, after several hours, the carriage finally drove quite deep into the forest and stopped right in front of a beautiful estate. The coachman approached the door and, opening it, turned to the lady, saying that they had arrived. After that, the man helped her out and then, bowing, replied that the young master was in this villa, so he said that she could come in. Of course, the girl was a little surprised and excited, but after looking at the entire estate as a whole, she plucked up her courage and went inside. The girl also thought about what they say, that the family's wealth has decreased. However, this villa was incredibly luxurious and even extravagant, and the interior inside was not inferior to these factors. While the coachman was escorting the girl to the place where the man was supposed to be waiting for her, she thought for some reason about his brother, and this made the girl feel very uncomfortable. Catherine was even a little angry, not understanding what had happened a few nights ago when she met Avon. She was still a little worried about the fact that he had returned to the south, but soon she didn't even notice how the man stopped. He turned to her and told her to wait in this room for a while, and after letting her in, he closed the door. Catherine walked over rather quickly and sat down on the red couch that stood in the middle, and then she began to look around, thinking that this Pavel was probably the type who loved luxury. Suddenly, someone knocked on the door. Catherine immediately noticed it and saw someone's silhouette behind the glass. After this, a rather quiet male voice was heard which asked if he could come in. Catherine, smiling, replied that, of course, he could do so. As soon as the door opened, she immediately stood up on her feet, and when she saw his face, she was simply incredibly amazed. She saw the man she did not expect to see. Catherine was incredibly angry, and all because Avon came into the room instead of Pavel and smiled at her very brazenly. The man, stepping forward, asked her if she really expected to see his brother, and added that such an ignorant tone did not suit her at all. The girl, without thinking twice, immediately started yelling at him and asked where his brother was, since she had come to see him. Avon, waving his hand, walked forward and said that, of course, he was in the north because he had broken all ties with their family, so he would never come, even if he called him. Then the girl asked what about the offer he had sent to her family, and the man explained that the family coat of arms could easily be purchased. And besides, it was quite easy in their time to find an expert who could forge absolutely any person's handwriting. Catherine didn't respond to this. She felt cheated and abandoned because she had already hoped that this would really be a productive meeting. Avon stood there and smiled insolently. After that, he asked her what she was thinking about. The girl, unable to contain her emotions, came closer to him, and hitting his chest with her finger, said that she was thinking about whether she should decide this personally or leave the matter to the law. But the guy would only continue to smile contentedly. He asked if it was true that the latter seemed impossible, because it was a little funny that a wife would accuse her husband of cheating. Catherine immediately laughed and asked what husband they were talking about, since he was obviously completely drunk to say such things. But the man explained everything quite calmly, said that a letter with her handwriting would be sent to the Duke's estate that evening. As soon as Catherine heard about this, she immediately became wary. And seeing her surprised expression, Avon explained that her handwriting was easy to find. He managed to track down the store that day after hearing about her unique ball. As soon as Catherine heard about this, she immediately remembered that she had signed some papers and filled out in the store before buying. Avon, waving his hands, said that he stepped in to take the place of his older brother and personally answered. During the inviolable conversation, the misunderstanding was explained to him. He also said that during all this, their feelings coincided and they decided to expand their love. The man continued to talk, and Catherine became more and more angry. He said that something that a daughter writes to her father, so he would not distort anything vague about their compatible bodies. At this point, Catherine clenched her hand into a fist and said that now he had a unique way to say that he did not want to die, because otherwise she would regard it as consent. But when Avon didn't answer, she immediately swung her fist at him. But the guy became much quicker and intercepted her hand at the same moment. He pulled the girl closer to him and asked if she still hadn't realized that she was trapped in this place until the wedding was over. Catherine looked straight into his yellow eyes with all her hatred and asked what he was even saying, and the man answered in a quiet voice that there was no transport that could bring her back. So, letting go of her hand, he told her to talk to the Duke about it, and then everything would be fine. Catherine started screaming at him loudly, her hand turning red from his strong grip. She asked him if he really thought she would marry someone like him just because of that. But Avon, smiling smugly, said she simply had no other choice. She would have to do it if she wanted to live. Catherine continued to scream, immediately saying that she didn't care what happened, but she would never marry him in her entire life. Avon said that of course she could think that, but he asked what would happen if he revealed the secret she was hiding. The girl looked at him with fear and immediately asked what secret he was talking about because she really didn't understand. When Avon moved closer to her and whispered in her ear the secret that he could tell absolutely everyone at any moment, and then she would regret not having agreed to his proposal. The girl, hearing about this, immediately froze in place. She, cherishing her voice, turned to him and asked how he even found out about this. But Avon could only stand there with a smug expression on his face, his hands in his pocket, and he was very proud that he had managed to find out this secret after all, and now he could easily manipulate the girl.